Hey everybody, and thanks for tuning in to the Ephrata Community Church weekly podcast. Conversation with our pastors and leaders meant to continue encouraging you to know God, know freedom, know purpose, and make a difference.
Hey, Ephrata Community Church, it is great to be with you once again here for our weekly podcast. My name is Matt Swords, the pastor of discipleship, joined by Jim Ehrman, who is our teaching pastor. And we're excited just to break down the message that Kevin brought this past weekend, as well as we're going to take some time to look forward into this coming weekend. Jim's going to be preaching, so we'll cover that in a few moments. But to look back on Kevin's message, it was titled The Road to More, out of Ephesians 3:20, how God can do immeasurably more than you can ask or imagine. And really encouraging us as his church, God's church, not Kevin's church, that like he not only can do...
Thank you for that note.
Yeah. Well, the way it came out, I'm like, I need to clarify that for someone.
Exactly right. There's someone in a cult right now going,
at least for Kevin himself, that needs clarified, because he'll say that all the time. This is not my church. This is God's church. So, God's church, this weekend, Ephesians 3:20. It's not only enough that he can do what you ask or imagine, because that would be sufficient. That'd be amazing. Yeah. He can do more than you ask or imagine. That would be awesome. And as Kevin mentioned, this is called adjective stacking. He can do far immeasurably more beyond what you can ask or imagine. Like the adjectives are just piled on to express the reality that God can do more than we ask or imagine.
You said that like 9 times. That's wonderful.
Yeah. So... Jim, what goes through your mind when you hear that verse? And what goes through your mind?
The verse, and then according to the power that is at work within us.
Right.
And I think for someone that didn't grow up in the charismatic stream of the church, I mean, I hate to go there as often as I do, but you have to understand that there is so much of my Christian spirituality that was built on what I would call natural law. Like if you live a certain way in God, I'm not even talking doing works, just you live a certain way, you get the blessings of God.
Yeah,
and
that's
I interpreted
Proverbs.
That, right, as almost the power of God, and really took the Holy Spirit and made the Holy Spirit something that was just something that sealed me for a future day and a way of life. And I think when I read now Ephesians 3 in this moment, and I'm like, hey, you're right. You're not much, but I trust you. There is a power that's at work in me, and we know that Paul is linking it earlier in the chapter to the resurrection, right? He says, there's a power at work in the resurrection. If you understood what that meant to be alive in you, of course you'd be doing more than you think you can imagine right now, because you are more than you can imagine. So I have to tell you, it's one of the reasons I still now believe we can break addictions. I believe we can break generational curses. I believe we can break cycles and habits. And not just that, I think missionally changing the world, not just getting our own interior life straightened out or our families' systems changed, but actually doing something in the world. I think this verse is right on.
Yeah.
I'm always happy to validate the scriptures,
Yeah, isn't that nice?
Anyway, thanks.
Yeah, for sure. And so Kevin used Peter as
Great example.
Exactly, an example to show how God can do incredible things through him, and it was effectively portrayed against the weakness of Peter's life, right? That's right. And one of my favorite passages out of Matthew 16 is when he says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter responds with, "You're the Messiah, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus responds back with a prophetic reality of who Peter is and what he is destined for in Christ, where he says, "Blessed are you, Peter," or Simon, "for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven, and you shall be called Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church." Right. And Kevin brought that out to say that Jesus prophetically saw Peter's potential, and once he established that, then went right into, and here's where Peter was when he said it. That's right. And I love that because Peter, as you know the Gospels and you know how the Acts turns out, was such a rock of the church. Literally was the one who was used as a vessel that the Spirit used to bring 3,000 people into the kingdom through a message. And so I love the encouragement that comes that despite the weak position that I'm currently in, that God still has a promise of what he's made me for, that it is beyond what I can ask or imagine. And I'm curious, Jim, like
Yeah.
Maybe, do you have any personal experience with that type of encounter with the Lord? And if so, I'd love to hear about that. And then also, how does that inform your pastoring, counseling, mentoring, as you relate to other people where they're in a weak position? How does this reality inform that?
Yeah, right on. And I love this verse where Jesus, he has him in Capernaum when he asked that question, which is always important to realize that Capernaum would be the Las Vegas of the United States at the moment. It's where you went to kind of get away. There weren't a lot of Jews watching, weren't a lot of Pharisees. And he takes his disciples to this sin city and asks them, who do you say that I am? So there's a whole lot that could go on there. But first of all, every young Jewish boy is already nervous just to be there. So even Peter speaking up and throwing out a question like, well, I think you're the Messiah. I mean, you can say that in Capernaum. You say that in Jerusalem at that moment, you get stoned by the Pharisees around. So this guy's actually confessing, I actually think you're God incarnate. To Jewish theology, it was radically different. So here's a guy that gets it absolutely right, probably gives one of the most profound answers disproportionate to his whole training and worldview at that time.
Yeah.
And 6 verses later, we know he gets so excited he got the first one right that he's like, oh no, you won't die on the cross. Because Jesus opens up then. He's like, oh my word, Simon. This has been revealed from beyond to you. And I think Jesus actually has a level of excitement about where they're at in their formation. They're 2 years into becoming disciples, right? He's starting to see fruit. And then he starts to say, well, maybe I'll tell him about how I'm going to die for him. And Peter's like, you ain't going to die, man. I'm going to kill anyone who tries to touch you. And then he says, get behind me, Satan. So what that means for me is I can nail it just right in one area and have this whole other part of my life that Jesus is still developing my worldview and my life. And so I carry mercy toward myself as a pastor and a minister. I carry mercy toward others as they're transforming. The key here, right, is that Peter was a man of humility, that when he did have something pointed out, we know he changed. Because both he and Judas betrayed Jesus on that last night. He knew what to do with it. Judas didn't. And then later, Paul confronts him. You got the vision at Joppa, man. And you still are not hanging out with Gentiles like you should be. And Peter changes. He starts hanging out with Gentiles. So there's one thing about this man. It is humility. I am perfected in your weaknesses, where Kevin ended the message. I'll take your weakness and make you great. So you'll get it so right some days and blow it on other days. Now, by the way, I'm not talking about rampant runaway sin here. I don't want this to become some major permissive thing. But I'm talking about in our formation, in what we're trying to do in the world, it's touch and go sometimes. Right?
Yeah. Man, is that not real? I mean, so often people can have a perspective, I know I did, where the person who's delivering a message so polished and so put together with such crazy stories and awesome testimonies and deep revelation, and you're like, all I can see is how I am not there.
Exactly right.
And yet,
if we're not careful.
And yet the reality, if we're not careful, and the reality is that any true power displayed through any human vessel is because there is an element that there was a weak area that was submitted to the Lord to fill with His power,
and that they've now gotten a breakthrough and revelation they can give to others. Right. I oftentimes say that, Jesus was able to walk on water, right? And you'll just get me going. The point I'm just trying to make there is that there is a kind of authority that comes when you get previous breakthroughs, right? That allow you to do these types of things. So that's one of the reasons if I see someone who's super impressive in ministry or up front or in counseling, I sit and go, man, isn't that beautiful where they worked out that skill and that gift in the kind of anvil and the pressure of what was going on in the world, and now they're giving it back to us. So it's one of the reasons it keeps me from setting anyone up on a pedestal too, because I recognize that most of us are ministering out of weaknesses and previous breakthroughs of our own. So
yeah, that's so true. There's a gentleman I was talking to, and who a few weeks back we had a testimony about a breakthrough that somebody had in their counseling journey and inner healing stuff. And I was talking with another guy who would have said, I feel like I need to go through that. And I would have immediately shared with him, essentially saying, well, I did. And it wasn't actually 10 years ago, it was in the past 6 months. And it was such a beautiful moment that almost liberated him to realize that wow, I'm not the only one.
Or I'm not behind, or I'm not right.
There's not something wrong with me, that I shouldn't be further than what I am. God's meeting me right where I am. And this, I personally love to tell people that oh yeah, I'm going through therapy. Yeah, I've done that. And it wasn't 10 years ago. It was just 6 months ago. That's where I'm at right now. And it helps people to realize that man, we all just are broken vessels doing our best to submit to a living God who loves us like a good father would, and wants to love a world that doesn't know him. And he's chosen to use broken vessels, like this treasure hidden in earthen vessels, as the word says. It is, I don't know, it is so empowering to people to then, and this specific gentleman I'm mentioning was just like, he's like, I'm going to do it. All of a sudden he's like, oh yeah, I'm definitely going to do this.
And if you think about where Kevin landed his sermon, you have Paul, the Apostle Paul, at the end of 2 Corinthians. And remember, the Corinthians are questioning his apostleship. If there's ever a time he should be dropping a resume of superstardom, it's to the Corinthians so that he can establish who he is in God. And remember, he ends 2 Corinthians by saying this, and he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I will boast about my weaknesses, that the power of Christ is dwelling in me, that the power of Christ will dwell in me. And so, I don't want to become a church that's just over fixated on all our broken spots, but I do want to be a church that welcomes the fact that we're all on our way to becoming like Christ. And it's in our weaknesses we get to see this power show up.
That's so good.
I think it is. I like the Bible. Big fan. Big fan of the message.
Thank you, Kevin, for bringing that this past weekend. You can catch that message, obviously, on the website and our media page there, or you can download the ECC app. It'll be there as well. And we're going to take a moment just to look forward to this coming weekend.
Yippee!
Jim, you're going to be bringing the message.
Hercules. This is new members weekend. Real important. Remember, the way we run so much, by the way, I keep looking at, we have a timer below the camera, so I keep forgetting to look at the camera. So if you all think I'm staring into space, it's not true. I'm looking straight at you now. But this week, just so you know, the way we do our sermon series is they run in 5 to 6 weeks. And then all of a sudden we might have a week or two that we take a little bit of a break before we launch into a new series. This is one of those break weeks. And Kevin turned to me a little while back. He's like, Jim, what would you do if you were just... And then we were like, hey, you know what? That happens to be New Member Week. And I'm like, hey, why don't we talk about community? So the title of my sermon this week is going to be Why I Do Church and Why I Chose This One. I'm actually going to get a little bit more personal about why do I actually believe we're called to gather together and to be a people and a community. Not just Christ followers, but I mean actually something called the church, which is 2 different things. I'll be talking a bit about that this weekend. And then I'm going to tell a story of why I chose this particular community. Anyway, going to be a lot of fun, I think, to establish, and even as people become members of our church, what are you stepping into, man?
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it as well. And if you're watching this and you're curious about membership, you're curious about ECC, maybe you've been watching online, you haven't been here before, or you've been coming for a while, want to learn more, we encourage you just to email us, ask@effortofcommunity.church, and you'll get connected with the pastor. We'd love to serve you and meet you however we can. Yeah. And we're looking forward to this coming weekend. It's our new members weekend. Jim's bringing the message. It's going to be amazing. So thank you for tuning in once again for our weekly podcast. And we look forward to being with you this weekend here at the church and connecting with you again next week for our podcast. So till then, take care. God bless. I'm looking forward to seeing you again soon.
Hope to see you soon. Bye.
Hey, thanks again for joining us today. We hope that you've been encouraged by listening and that you'll join us again next week. You can listen to previous episodes, find additional resources, and of course, learn more about us by visiting effortofcommunitychurch.com.